The night it happened, the rain came down in sheets. Not gentle drops, but the kind that seemed to hammer every mistake into the pavement. Headlights blurred, wipers slapped helplessly, and in that storm a father and son's lives veered onto a road neither of them had chosen. It was just past midnight when Daniel gripped the wheel too tight. He was 21, barely a man, but too old to admit he was scared. His father had always said, "Rain is just weather, son. Don't let it own you." But rain like this, it owned everything. The world was a smear of yellow streetlights and red taillights. And then a deer, a shadow. Daniel never knew. The car jerked, the tires screamed, and the sickening crunch of metal against flesh, or was it steel, echoed louder than the storm itself. Time doesn't stop in a crash. It just shatters into fragments. The smell of burnt rubber. The sound of his own breath, ragged and sharp. The flash of broken glass across his hoodie. And then silence, an awful silence, the kind that makes your heart pound louder than thunder. "Dad, oh God, Dad!" Daniel's voice cracked. His father, Michael, was in the passenger seat. He wasn't injured, not yet, but his eyes had seen enough storms in life to know when one was about to swallow them whole. They stumbled out of the car. The rain didn't care about their panic. It poured on, indifferent, washing blood. Or maybe it was oil down the asphalt. A figure lay crumpled near the curb. Not moving. Daniel froze, his chest hollowing out as if someone had scooped his soul away. I didn't mean." His words dissolved in the storm. His hands shook like a boy caught in the act, except this wasn't spilled milk, this wasn't a broken vase. This was a life. Michael put his hand on his son's shoulder. It was a heavy hand, not just in weight, but in history. That same hand had once lifted Daniel high into the air as a child, had fixed his bicycle chain, had written checks for college tuition when there was no money to spare. Now that hand had to hold up the entire world. "Look at me," Michael said, voice low, steady, like a man who had spent his whole life practicing calm in chaos. Daniel couldn't. His eyes were locked on the still figure. The sirens were coming. You could hear them in the distance, growing, wailing, promising judgment. "I've ruined everything," Daniel whispered. "My job, my future, Dad, they'll take it all away." Michael's jaw tightened. He had heard this tone before, the fear of a child, even when the child had the face of a grown man. The rain hit harder, the sirens closer. Every second was a door closing. And that's when Michael made his choice. He pulled his son close, so close that Daniel could feel the warmth of his father's breath despite the cold storm. "You listen to me," he said. "No one's taking your future. Not tonight, not like this." Daniel shook his head. "But it was me. I was driving." His voice cracked open, raw. Michael's eyes softened, not in pity but in love, the kind of love that has carried groceries in both hands and still reached out for a child's tiny fingers. "Son," he whispered, "let me carry this one." When the police lights painted the rain red and blue, Michael stepped forward. The officer's flashlight cut across his soaked jacket, his weathered face. "I was driving," Michael said. His voice didn't tremble. It didn't need to. Behind him, Daniel stood frozen, torn between screaming the truth and collapsing into silence. The officers moved quickly, handcuffs, questions, procedure. It all blurred together. But Michael kept glancing back at his son, each look saying the same thing without words. "Live, go on. Don't waste the chance I just gave you." Later, when the tow truck arrived, when the road was taped off, when the storm had eased into a gentle drizzle, Daniel still stood there, just a boy in a soaked hoodie, shivering not from the cold but from the weight of what had just happened. He wanted to run to his father, to tell the truth, to undo it all. But his feet would not move, because deep inside he knew. This wasn't the first time his father had taken the hit for him. It was just the first time the whole world would see it. And so the night ended with a father in the back of a squad car, hands chained but spirit unbroken, and a son left standing in the rain, unchained but forever bound by guilt. The rain washed the road clean, but it could not wash away what had just begun. The night after the accident, Daniel sat alone in his room, his hoodie still damp, the smell of rain clinging to the fabric as though the storm had followed him inside. The house was quiet, too quiet. Down the hall, his mother's muffled sobs came and went like a tide, while his father's absence pressed on the walls like a missing beam. Daniel stared at his desk. On it sat the acceptance letter from the architecture firm in Chicago. Black ink, clean lines, the kind of paper that feels heavy in your hands, as though it carries not just words but the weight of a future. He had dreamed of this moment since high school, designing buildings that touched the sky, proving to the world he was more than just a small-town kid with a tired father and a worn-out car. And now, after one reckless night, those dreams felt paper-thin, one confession away from crumbling into dust. He closed his eyes and memories unspooled. The scent of sawdust in the garage, where his father worked late fixing broken chairs and squeaky doors for neighbors who couldn't afford a carpenter. The clink of coins dropped into a glass jar labeled college fund, back when Daniel was 10 and thought pennies could pay for the world. The faint taste of instant noodles, dinners eaten quietly while bills stacked on the counter like silent threats. Back then he had promised himself, "I'll make it, I'll give him a reason to rest," but promises are light things. What weighed heavy was reality, the flashing police lights, the cold rain, his father's voice saying, "Let me carry this one." He tried to study his reflection in the darkened window. The storm had passed, leaving the glass streaked and spotted, his face fractured into pieces by the faint light outside. What he saw was not a man. Not yet. Just a boy with shoulders too narrow for the burden that had been placed on them. Every sound in the house reminded him of the cost, the squeak of the floorboards under his mother's pacing feet, the distant tick of the old kitchen clock, each second reminding him that his father was counting time in a cell instead of in his own bed. Even the refrigerator hummed louder, as if scolding him for filling the silence with guilt. Daniel thought about the years his father had carried him, invisible weights Daniel never noticed until now. The smell of engine oil when Michael came home from the factory, his fingernails stained black no matter how much he scrubbed. The calluses on his palms, hard as gravel, that once brushed Daniel's feverish forehead in the middle of the night. The old pickup truck, patched with duct tape, that somehow still got Daniel to every soccer practice, every late-night shift at the diner, every exam he thought would decide his life. Michael had carried all of it, and Daniel, he had carried nothing. Now he sat at the edge of his bed, hands trembling, pressing against his knees as though trying to hold himself together. He wanted to cry, but the tears stuck somewhere deep, locked behind a dam of shame. Instead, he whispered to the empty room, "I should be the one in there." His voice barely reached the walls. It sounded too young, too fragile, a confession meant for no one. But even unspoken, the truth clung to him like smoke after a fire. Every breath tasted of it. When morning came, sunlight broke through the blinds in thin stripes. Daniel blinked against the brightness, but it didn't warm him. Outside, the world had already moved on. Children riding bikes, a delivery truck rumbling past, neighbors mowing their lawns. Life carried forward, unbothered by the fact that his father's world had stopped. Daniel picked up the letter again. The embossed logo at the top glimmered in the light, a promise of office towers and glass windows, of a salary big enough to pay debts and ease old worries. But his hands shook and the letter slipped back onto the desk. The paper no longer felt like hope, it felt like betrayal. He sat there for a long time, listening. The house smelled faintly of coffee gone cold in the kitchen. Birds chirped outside, ordinary, careless. And under all of it, beneath the sounds of life moving on, there was the steady thud of his own heartbeat, reminding him of the impossible trade that had been made. His father's freedom, for his own. And though he was only 21, Daniel understood something he had never wanted to know. Dreams can lift you, yes, but they can also crush you when they rest on someone else's broken back. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee, that sharp mixture of cleanliness and exhaustion that clings to waiting rooms. Daniel sat in one of the plastic chairs, his legs jittering, his palms damp, as though his body were trying to run even while his mind stayed frozen. Across from him, his mother clutched her purse with both hands. The leather strap creaked each time she tightened her grip, her knuckles pale. Her eyes stayed locked on the linoleum floor, as if looking up would invite a truth she could not bear to face. No one spoke. The silence in hospitals is never real silence. It is the hum of machines, the squeak of sneakers on polished floors, the low murmur of nurses at the desk. But for Daniel, every sound was muffled, as though the whole world had been stuffed with cotton. A door opened. A doctor stepped out, his scrubs darkened with sweat. He scanned the room, then called a name. The victim's family rose, faces streaked with tears. They gathered around the doctor, and though Daniel could not hear the words, he could read the story in their collapsing shoulders, in the wails that broke free like something long caged. The man he had struck was dying, maybe already gone. Daniel's stomach turned to stone. His chest tightened until he could barely breathe. This wasn't just an accident anymore. This was a life crossing that invisible threshold, the thin line between what could be forgiven and what could never be undone. His mother finally looked at him. Her eyes were red, but her gaze was steady, heavy with the weight of both fear and truth. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice breaking on his name, "if that man dies." She didn't finish. She didn't need to. The words hung there unfinished because their meaning was already crushing. Daniel dropped his face into his hands. The skin of his palms smelled faintly of rain-soaked asphalt, a scent he couldn't wash away no matter how much he scrubbed. He wanted to vanish inside that smell, inside that darkness, and never return. It was then that his father appeared, escorted by an officer. His hair was still wet from the storm, his shirt rumpled, his wrists bound loosely in front of him. Yet his steps were steady, measured, almost calm. Michael's eyes found his son's immediately, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with something fiercer, something heavier, resolve. He asked to speak with Daniel alone. The officer hesitated, then stepped back a few paces. Michael leaned close, his voice low enough that only his son could hear. "They'll make this about you. They'll look at your age, your whole life ahead of you, and they'll turn it into a sentence long enough to crush it all." Daniel shook his head, words tumbling out in a panic. "I can't let you, Dad, I can't let you do this. It was me. It was my hands on the wheel." Michael pressed a hand against Daniel's chest, firm and grounding. "I know." The way he said it, calm, unshaken, hit Daniel harder than any shout. It was not denial, it was acceptance. "You have a chance to build something," Michael continued. "You can still walk into that firm, sit at a desk, design buildings that last longer than storms. That man's family may never forgive us, but I can carry that weight. You can't, not yet." Daniel felt tears pushing against the corners of his eyes, hot and insistent. His throat burned. "Dad, this isn't fair." "No," Michael agreed, his voice soft but unyielding. "It isn't, but fairness doesn't keep you alive. Choices do, and this is mine." The officer returned, signaling that the visit was over. Michael straightened, squaring his shoulders, and in that small gesture Daniel saw the years of labor, the nights his father came home bone-tired but still managed to smile, the unspoken sacrifices woven into every meal, every school fee, every moment of safety he had ever known. As Michael was led away, Daniel reached out, desperate. "Dad." Michael turned once, just once, his expression illuminated under the harsh fluorescent lights. There was no fear in it. Only a kind of fierce peace, the look of a man who had decided that his life's purpose was no longer his own survival but his son's. Later that night, Daniel sat again in his room. The house seemed smaller now, the walls closer, the air heavier. Through the window, he could see the faint glow of streetlights reflected in puddles that dotted the road. The rain had stopped, but the world still looked wet, as though it carried the memory of the storm. He thought of the victim's family, the cries in that waiting room. He thought of his mother's silence, the way her grief came out sideways, pressing into the floor with every step. And he thought of his father's voice, calm in the face of ruin. "This is mine to carry." For the first time, Daniel realized what it meant to be young. Not freedom, not possibility, but the unbearable truth that someone else might still be paying the price for your mistakes. And in that realization, his heart cracked open. The interrogation room was colder than Daniel expected. Its walls were painted a dull gray, the kind of color that made time feel longer. A single light buzzed above the table, casting a faint hum that filled the spaces where words should have been. Daniel sat on one side, his body rigid, his hands clenched so tightly that his nails pressed half-moons into his skin. Across from him, his father sat with a stillness that seemed almost unnatural, shoulders square, face calm, as if he had rehearsed this moment in silence for years. An officer entered, clipboard in hand. His badge caught the light, a sudden gleam against the monotony of the room. He looked first at Michael, then at Daniel, then back again, as though weighing which man would give him the truth. "All right," the officer said, pulling out a chair with a scrape. "We need your statements. Let's start from the beginning." Daniel's throat tightened. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. The words trembled on his lips. "It was me. I was driving." But before he could speak, his father's voice cut through the silence, firm and steady. "I was behind the wheel." The officer looked up, pen paused. "Mr. Miller, you understand what you're saying?" Michael nodded. "I was driving the car. I lost control. I struck the man." Daniel's chest seized. He gripped the edge of the table as if it could anchor him against the tide of those words. "No," he blurted, shaking his head. "That's not." Michael's eyes snapped to him. Not angry, not desperate, just commanding in that quiet way fathers can be. "Daniel," he said softly, but there was steel beneath it. "Enough." The officer's gaze flicked between them. "Son, you want to add something." Daniel swallowed hard. His tongue felt heavy, his mouth dry. He could almost feel his father's hand pressing against his chest again, that invisible weight of protection. His lips parted, then closed. The words died in his throat. Michael leaned forward, his voice even deliberate. "It was me. Put it down." The officer scribbled, his pen scratching against the paper. Every stroke felt like a nail driven deeper into a coffin Daniel couldn't escape. When the officer stepped out to make a call, silence returned to the room. Daniel turned to his father, desperation spilling over. "Dad, please, you don't have to do this. They'll listen if I tell them." Michael shook his head slowly. "You think they'll show mercy? You're 21, Daniel. They'll make an example out of you. One mistake and they'll brand you with it for life." Tears stung Daniel's eyes. "I can't let you throw yourself away. I can't." Michael's face softened, though his voice stayed firm. "Son, I've already lived my life. I've made my choices. This one's mine too." Daniel felt the sting of those words like a door closing. He wanted to fight, to scream, but his father's calmness swallowed his protest whole. "You'll go on," Michael continued, his tone almost tender now. "You'll walk into that firm, you'll build something that lasts. And when you do, you'll remember me, not as a man who sat in a cell, but as the father who gave you the chance to stand free." The room blurred through Daniel's tears. The hum of the light above grew louder, almost unbearable, as if the world itself was pressing down on him. "I don't deserve this," Daniel whispered. Michael reached across the table, the chain on his wrist clinking softly as his hand covered his son's. "Maybe not," he said, "but love doesn't ask what's deserved, it just gives." The door opened. The officer returned, flanked by another man with a folder tucked under his arm. "All right," the officer said briskly. "We'll finalize this. Mr. Miller, you'll be processed tonight." Daniel's stomach dropped. This was it, the moment the lie became truth in the eyes of the law. Michael stood when told, his movements measured, dignified. As they turned him toward the door, he glanced back at Daniel one last time. In that look, Daniel saw everything. The long nights his father worked when his body wanted to quit, the quiet sacrifices never spoken aloud, the fierce pride hidden in gentle eyes. And now this, his greatest sacrifice of all. Daniel's breath caught, his voice breaking free in a whisper that barely carried. "Dad," Michael held his gaze. A faint smile touched his lips, one that trembled at the edges but held steady. "Live, son," he said. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a final, echoing click. The house did not feel like home anymore. It felt hollow, as though something essential had been ripped out of the walls and left the air trembling. Daniel stood in the kitchen, staring at the sink piled with unwashed plates. The faint smell of garlic and burnt oil lingered from a dinner no one had eaten. His mother's footsteps paced back and forth in the living room, sharp against the wooden floor, each step like a nail being driven into the silence. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked the air. "Do you even understand what he's done?" Daniel froze, hands pressed against the cool edge of the counter. "I understand," he said quietly. Her laugh came out bitter, sharp. "No, you don't. You think this is about you. You think this is about your job, your future. But it's not just you, Daniel. It's me. It's this family. Your father didn't just give himself away, he gave us all away." She turned toward him, her face pale, the corners of her eyes red from sleepless nights. "He should be here. He should be sitting in that chair, drinking his awful black coffee, arguing with me about the thermostat, but he's not. He's locked up because of you." Daniel flinched, the words striking deeper than any blow. He tried to answer, but his throat tightened. His body shook with the weight of guilt that no apology could lighten. "I never asked him to. You didn't have to," she snapped. "He saw the truth in your face and he made the choice you were too cowardly to stop. Do you think that makes you innocent? No, that makes you complicit." The word hung heavy, thicker than the smell of last night's untouched stew. Neighbors had begun to notice too. The blinds in the house across the street shifted whenever Daniel stepped outside. At the grocery store, conversations hushed the moment he walked past. He could feel their stares on his back, their whispered judgment sticking like burrs to his skin. "Did you hear? It was the son, not the father. No, the police said it was Michael. Well, that boy always was reckless. Apple doesn't fall far, does it? The words weren't said to his face, but Daniel carried them anyway, every syllable weighing him down. At night, the house grew unbearably quiet. His mother often sat at the edge of her bed with the lamp turned low, staring at the framed photo of their wedding day. Her lips moved silently, as if speaking to a man who could no longer answer. Sometimes Daniel stood in the hallway and watched her. He wanted to walk in to say something, anything that might bridge the distance between them. But the gulf was too wide, carved by his father's sacrifice and his own silence. One evening, as she folded laundry at the kitchen table, she broke the silence again. "You think he's a hero," she said without looking up. "But I don't. Heroes don't abandon their wives. Heroes don't choose prison over family." Her fingers trembled as she pressed a shirt flat, smoothing it again and again, as though the fabric might yield a different truth. "I married a man who was supposed to stand beside me. Now he stands behind bars, and I'm left to pick up the pieces of the son he tried to protect." Daniel felt his chest cave under her words. He wanted to defend his father, to insist that Michael had done what any loving parent would do. But the bitterness in her voice told him she was not asking for his defense. She was asking for her grief to be heard. Later that night, Daniel lay awake in his room. The ceiling above him glowed faintly in the moonlight, the paint cracked in fine lines he had never noticed before. The smell of detergent clung to his sheets, sharp and clean, but it did nothing to wash away the dirt in his chest. He thought of his father's steady eyes in the interrogation room, the weight of his mother's accusations, the whispers of the neighbors. Every side of his life felt broken, pulled apart by forces he couldn't hold together. For the first time, he realized that sacrifice didn't just wound the one who made it. It wounded everyone left behind. His father bore the chains, but his mother bore the loneliness. And he bore the guilt that bound them all. The sound of a dog barking somewhere down the street snapped him from his thoughts. The world outside went on, unbothered. But inside the Miller house, everything had splintered, and no one knew if it could be put back together. The cell door clanged shut with a metallic finality that echoed down the corridor. Michael sat on the narrow cot, its thin mattress covered in stiff fabric that smelled faintly of bleach and sweat. The room was small, barely wider than his outstretched arms, and the air carried a damp chill that settled into his bones. He had imagined jail before, in the abstract way people imagine disasters that happen to others. But imagination never included the smells, the sour tang of unwashed clothes, the stale odor of metal and stone. It never included the sounds either. The shouts that ricocheted from one end of the block to the other, laughter edged with menace, the rhythmic rattle of a tin cup against bars. Michael leaned back, his head resting against the cold wall. His wrists still ached where the cuffs had dug in. It wasn't the pain that stayed with him, though. It was the memory of Daniel's face when the officers led him away, eyes wide, mouth trembling, a boy watching his world collapse. For Michael, that image was worse than any cell. The first night passed slowly. He tried to sleep, but every creak of footsteps, every slam of a distant door kept him awake. His stomach growled. The food had been tasteless, a pale lump of mashed potatoes and something that might have been meat. The fluorescent light above hummed relentlessly, bathing everything in a sterile glow that made it impossible to tell night from morning. When dawn finally came, he rose with stiff joints and lined up with the others for breakfast. The cafeteria reeked of burnt coffee and grease. Men shuffled past with trays, their eyes darting sideways, measuring him, weighing his presence. Some looked away quickly. Others lingered, smirking, whispering words he couldn't hear but could feel, sharp as knives. He ate little. The eggs were rubbery, the toast soggy, but hunger was easier to ignore than the stares. By midday, the first test came. In the yard, under a sky washed pale with thin clouds, two men approached. One was tall, with a jagged scar across his cheek. The other smaller, his smile too wide. "You the new guy?" the tall one said. Not a question. Michael nodded once. "You here for a DUI?" the smaller one asked. His voice carried mockery, like he already knew the answer. Michael didn't respond. Silence had always been his strength on the factory floor, at the dinner table when arguments sparked, even in the interrogation room. He knew silence could protect, but here it drew them closer. The tall man stepped into his space, the smell of tobacco on his breath. "Word is you took a fall for somebody, that true?" Michael's jaw tightened. Rumors traveled fast in places like this, faster than light through glass. He said nothing, but his stillness betrayed enough. The smaller one chuckled, low and sharp. Guess that makes you noble or stupid. They didn't hit him, not that day. But they laughed as they walked off, and somehow the laughter felt worse. It followed him back to his cell, clinging to the air like smoke. That night Michael lay awake again, the cot springs digging into his back. His body ached, but his mind stayed fixed on Daniel. He imagined his son sitting at the desk in his room, staring at that letter from Chicago, unable to touch it. He imagined his wife pacing the living room, her face lined with grief and anger. And in the quiet hours, when the block had settled into restless snores and coughs, he asked himself the question that had haunted him since the moment he confessed. Had he saved his son, or only doomed himself? The silence offered no answer. The days blurred together, a cycle of noise and waiting. Meals that tasted of metal spoons. Showers that reeked of chlorine. Guards shouting numbers instead of names. But the hardest part wasn't the routines. It was the loss of small freedoms, the weight of a keychain in his pocket, the warmth of sunlight through his own window, the sound of his wife's laughter when he said something clumsy but kind. Here, everything was stripped down, reduced, flattened, and Michael carried it all quietly, never allowing the despair to show on his face. On the third night, when the block had gone dark, a letter slid under his door. The envelope was thin, the handwriting familiar. He picked it up, his fingers trembling, and unfolded the paper. It was from Daniel. The ink smudged in places, as if his son had gripped the pen too hard. "Dad, I don't know how to live with this. Mom barely looks at me. The neighbors know. I hear them whisper when I walk by. You told me to go on, but every step I take feels like I'm stealing it from you. I don't know how long I can carry this." Michael pressed the paper to his chest. For the first time since entering the cell, his eyes burned with tears he had sworn he wouldn't let fall. The cot groaned as he sat down heavily, the letter still in his hand. This was the first price, not the concrete walls, not the loss of freedom, not the hunger or the stares. The first price was watching his son drown in guilt while he himself bore the blame. And Michael knew it was only the beginning. The first time Claire Hastings met Michael Miller, she thought he looked less like a man accused of a crime and more like a man who had worked too many double shifts. His hands were rough, knuckles marked by old scars, and his shoulders sloped as though years of labor had bent them into submission. When he spoke, his voice was steady, measured, almost too calm. It was the calm that troubled her. Claire had been a defense attorney long enough to recognize the difference between guilt and sacrifice. True guilt carried nervous energy, eyes darting, fingers tapping, words spilling too fast. But sacrifice wore a different face. It was quiet, deliberate, like a man bracing for a storm and refusing to flinch. Sitting across from him in the prison's consultation room, Claire opened her notebook. "Mr. Miller," she began, "I want to hear it in your own words. Walk me through what happened that night." Michael folded his hands on the table. Rain tapped faintly on the narrow window above them, a sound that seemed to carry its own echo. "I was driving home with my son. Roads were slick. I lost control, that's all there is." She studied him, just like that. Yes. No distractions, no alcohol, nothing unusual. No. Claire wrote the words down, though they told her nothing new. It was his delivery that unsettled her. The pauses too exact, the sentences too neat, as if rehearsed. After the meeting, Claire drove out to the crash site herself. The evening light stretched long shadows across the asphalt. The road was still scarred, faint skid marks curving toward the gutter where the victim had fallen. She crouched near the spot, tracing the marks with her eyes. Something didn't fit. The skid pattern was sharper than she expected for someone Michael's age, someone with reflexes slowed by decades of physical wear. It looked like the panicked turn of a younger driver. She jotted a note in the margin of her pad, "Too quick, too clean, not him." The next day, Claire requested the police file. She scanned the photographs, fragments of glass, blood on the curb, the twisted frame of the car. Her pen tapped against the desk as she reached the detail she'd been looking for, the seat adjustment. The driver's seat had been pulled closer to the wheel than Michael's frame suggested. For a man of his height, the steering wheel would have pressed uncomfortably against his chest. But for someone younger, someone like Daniel, it made sense. She closed the file slowly, the room around her humming with fluorescent light. Her gut tightened. The next time she visited Michael, she pressed harder. "Your statement doesn't match the physical evidence," she said, flipping open her folder. The seat was too far forward. The skid marks suggest a sharper reaction time than you'd likely have. And your blood work came back clean. Not even a trace of alcohol or prescription medication. It's neat, too neat. Michael met her eyes without flinching. "You're saying you don't believe me. I'm saying the story doesn't add up." He leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Then maybe you should close the folder and stop asking questions. Represent me as I am, not as you want me to be." Her pen stilled over the page. "Mr. Miller, if you're protecting someone." The steel in his gaze cut her sentence in half. "My son has nothing to do with this." The denial came too quickly. Claire had built her career on the speed of answers, the way the human body betrays what the mouth tries to hide. And this answer was lightning fast, too fast. She didn't push further, not yet. But the suspicion dug in deeper, like a splinter under the skin. Driving home that night, Claire rolled down her window. The city air smelled faintly of gasoline and wet asphalt. She thought of her own father, long gone now, a man who would have thrown himself into fire if it meant shielding her from the burn. She wondered if that was what she was looking at in Michael Miller. Not a criminal, but a parent choosing chains over watching his child's life collapse. But justice didn't work on sentiment. Justice needed facts, evidence, truth carved clean enough to hold up in court. She gripped the wheel tighter, her jaw set. If Michael was lying, she would find out. And if Daniel carried the real guilt, the law would catch up to him, whether Michael wanted it or not. The rain started again, soft at first, then harder, the drops streaking across her windshield. Claire blinked into the blur of lights, her gut heavy with questions she could no longer ignore. The case was no longer just another file on her desk. It was a knot she could feel pulling tighter with every breath. Daniel could not escape the sound of the accident. It lived inside him, the sudden squeal of tires, the hollow thud, the silence afterward that pressed against his ears like a weight. Even in sleep it returned. Some nights he jolted awake to the echo of breaking glass, his chest tight, his hands clutching the sheets as though holding on could pull him back into a different reality. The days blurred together. At breakfast, his mother moved around the kitchen like a shadow, silent except for the scrape of plates and the occasional slam of a cupboard. She rarely looked at him. When she did, her eyes seemed to see not the boy she had raised but the crack in their family that had swallowed her husband whole. Daniel stopped trying to talk. His words only deepened her silence. At work, he lasted barely a week before quitting. The whispers followed him, co-workers who avoided eye contact, managers who shuffled papers whenever he entered the room. No one said the words directly, but he could feel them in the pauses, in the way their voices dipped when he walked by. That's the son of the man in jail. Was it really him behind the wheel? At night, he walked the neighborhood streets alone. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and car exhaust, and the houses glowed with the warm yellows of other families eating dinner together. He kept his hood up, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his steps heavy. Sometimes he caught his reflection in a darkened window, pale face, hollow eyes, and turned away quickly, unable to look at the stranger staring back. The letter he had sent to his father gnawed at him. He pictured Michael unfolding it in his cell, reading the smudged ink where Daniel's hand had trembled. The thought of his father carrying not only the weight of prison, but also the weight of his son's guilt made Daniel sick. More than once he picked up the phone, dialing the prison's number, but each time he hung up before the call connected. What could he say? That he wanted to trade places, that he was too weak to endure the gift his father had given him. One evening, unable to bear the silence of the house, Daniel drove aimlessly. The city lights smeared across the windshield, red and white blurs in the drizzle. He ended up at the hospital, parked outside the same building, where he had first seen the victim's family crumble under the weight of bad news. Through the sliding glass doors, he caught sight of a woman carrying a bouquet of wilted flowers, her shoulders slumped. A child trailed behind her, clutching a worn, stuffed animal. The sight twisted something in him. That family still lived with the consequences of his hands, even as his own father carried the punishment. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. His chest burned with the need to confess, to walk inside and tell them everything. But his father's voice echoed in his mind. "You'll go on, you'll build something." The words held him back like invisible chains binding his tongue. The guilt seeped into his body. Food lost its taste. Sleep became fractured. He grew thinner, his clothes hanging looser, his shoulders sagging. Everywhere he went, he felt eyes on him, even when no one was there. One afternoon, he visited the library, thinking a change of scenery might help. But as he sat among the quiet rows of books, a newspaper lay abandoned on the table. The headline caught his eye: "Community demands justice in hit-and-run case." Beneath the headline was his father's name. The article described the victim's condition, the outrage of neighbors, the calls for stricter sentences. And in the middle of it all, Michael Miller was painted as reckless, careless, dangerous. Daniel's stomach turned. His father's reputation, the man who had once been known for his steady work and quiet reliability, was being shredded in print. And Daniel was the reason. He shoved the paper away and fled the library, the fluorescent lights flickering above him as if they, too, judged his every step. That night, Daniel sat in his room with the window open, the cool air carrying the faint scent of rain-soaked earth. He stared at the architecture sketches pinned above his desk, tall buildings drawn with sharp lines and hopeful notes in the margins. They mocked him now, silent reminders of a future stolen not by fate but by his own hands. He whispered to himself, a confession no one else could hear. "It should be me." The words trembled in the air, fragile and small, but they carried the weight of everything he had been burying. His chest ached, his throat raw, his eyes burning. Still, the walls of his room held the secret close, keeping it locked where no one could use it to set his father free. Daniel lay back on his bed, the ceiling above him pale in the moonlight. Sleep did not come, only the guilt, heavier each day, pressing harder against the parts of him, still trying to believe he deserved the life his father had fought to protect. The courthouse buzzed like a hive. Reporters crowded the steps, their voices overlapping in a tangle of questions, microphones thrust forward, cameras clicking with merciless precision. For days the story had grown, an ordinary man accused of taking a life in the rain, the whispers of leniency, the outrage of neighbors who wanted justice. And standing in the middle of that noise was a man who intended to make the case his own. Assistant District Attorney Mark Whitmore adjusted his tie as he climbed the steps. He was known in the city for his sharp suits and sharper ambition. Where others saw tragedy, Whitmore saw opportunity. The community's grief was fuel, the cameras his stage. "This isn't just about one victim," he told a reporter, his voice steady, polished. "This is about sending a message. Reckless drivers must know there are consequences." The cameras ate it up. Every word sharpened the narrative. A prosecutor who would not bend, a case that would become a landmark. Behind him, the courthouse doors loomed heavy, their brass handles glinting in the morning light. Whitmore's reflection stared back at him, confident, hungry. Inside, Claire Hastings watched from a distance. She had seen men like Whitmore before, men who treated cases as stepping stones, families as headlines, defendants as names to be crossed out on their way to higher office. She flipped open her file, scanning once more the details that didn't sit right. The seat pulled forward, the quickness of the skid, the silence of a father who seemed too willing to bury himself. Her gut told her this wasn't the whole story, but Whitmore didn't want the whole story. He wanted a conviction. Michael, shackled at the wrists, was led into the courtroom. The murmurs rose immediately: neighbors, journalists, strangers who had come simply to see a man in chains. The smell of cologne and paper mingled with the faint scent of floor polish, the sterile tang of justice in practice. Daniel sat at the back, his hoodie drawn tight, head bowed. Every word spoken at the front seemed to reverberate inside him. The clicking of keyboards, the shuffling of papers, the scrape of chairs, it all blended into a storm of noise that pressed against his chest. When Whitmore rose to speak, the room hushed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the weight of certainty, "this is not a case of misfortune. This is a case of negligence. A man chose to drive recklessly and another man paid with his life. We cannot allow sympathy to cloud justice." His eyes flicked briefly to the gallery, landing on Daniel for the briefest second. It was enough to make Daniel's stomach knot, as if the prosecutor could see straight through him. Later, in the dim hallway outside the courtroom, Whitmore spoke in low tones to a colleague. "Keep pressure on the press. The more outrage we stir, the harder it will be for the defense to soften him." Claire, passing by, caught enough of the words to know his strategy. Her jaw tightened. Whitmore wasn't chasing truth, he was chasing victory. That evening Daniel walked home alone. The streets glowed with neon signs, the air thick with the smell of fried food and exhaust. His body moved, but his mind stayed trapped in the courtroom, replaying Whitmore's words. Negligence, consequences, justice. Each word felt like it had been carved into his skin. He imagined his father sitting in the holding cell after the hearing, staring at walls that would not answer back. He imagined Whitmore at home, glass of whiskey in hand, satisfied with the headlines that would appear in the morning. The imbalance of it made Daniel's fists clench. His father's sacrifice was not protection anymore, it was bait, and Whitmore was ready to devour it. Back in her office, Claire sifted through her notes, a lamp casting warm light across the papers. She replayed Michael's voice in her head, steady, unwavering. She thought of Daniel's slumped shoulders in the gallery, the way he seemed to fold in on himself with every word spoken against his father. Her instincts screamed that Whitmore was wrong, or at least incomplete. This case wasn't just about negligence. It was about a silence too heavy, a guilt too visible, a son who carried something unspoken in the way his eyes refused to meet hers. Claire leaned back, rubbing her temples. If she pushed too hard, Michael would resist. If she stayed quiet, Whitmore would win. And somewhere between them stood Daniel, unraveling by the day. She picked up her pen and wrote in the margin of her file, "Find what he's hiding." The words stared back at her, a challenge and a promise. The storm was gathering, and the hidden enemy was not only Whitmore's ambition. It was the truth itself, waiting to break through, no matter who it destroyed. The prison walls had a way of stealing time. Days bled into one another, marked not by sunrise or sunset, but by the clang of doors, the rattle of keys, the barked orders of guards. For Michael, each day was another stone laid on the pile he had chosen to carry. At first, he thought the hardest part would be the confinement, the narrow cell, the scratchy blanket, the endless noise of men packed together. But it wasn't the walls that weighed him down. It was what lay beyond them. The knowledge that his wife slept alone, that his son walked the streets under the shadow of whispers, that every hour he spent inside made the lie more permanent. He told himself it was worth it, but worth did not make it easier. In the yard, he kept his head down. The air smelled of sweat and rust, the chain-link fences cutting sharp against the horizon. He learned quickly that silence was both shield and target, protection from fights, but also an invitation to test how far he could bend. One afternoon, two men cornered him near the wall. Their voices were low, almost friendly, but their eyes carried hunger. "Word is you're taking the fall for somebody," one said. "That true?" Michael didn't answer. He knew the rule: admit nothing, deny nothing, survive. The second man stepped closer, the scent of stale cigarettes clinging to his breath. "You're a hero in here, you know, but heroes don't last long." A shove followed, hard enough to send him stumbling against the concrete. His shoulder scraped, raw pain blooming in sharp lines. But he stayed upright. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him fall. That night he lay on his cot, the ache in his shoulder radiating through him. His body reminded him of his age, of years spent lifting more than he should, of joints worn thin. Still, he closed his eyes and whispered the same silent prayer: "Keep Daniel safe. Let him stay free." The letters kept coming. Daniel's handwriting grew messier with each one, as if guilt made the pen too heavy to hold steady. "Dad, I can't sleep. Dad, I can't look people in the eye. Dad, I don't know how to live with this." Michael read them in the dim light of his cell, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. He wanted to write back with easy reassurances, the kind fathers give their children after a nightmare. "It will be fine, you'll be fine." But lies had already brought him here. So instead, he wrote truth softened by love. "Daniel's strength doesn't mean you don't feel the weight. It means you carry it anyway. Live, that's all I ask. Live." He folded the letters carefully, each one a lifeline he hoped would reach his son before the guilt drowned him. Weeks passed and the toll deepened. His hair thinned faster, his hands shook more when he tried to write. Some nights his cough echoed in the cell, rough and persistent, drawing irritated groans from the men around him. The medical ward smelled of disinfectant and despair, and though the nurse gave him pills, he knew they were only a bandage, not a cure. Still, he refused to complain. To admit weakness would make his sacrifice smaller, tainted by the thought that he had not been strong enough to bear it. Claire Hastings visited again, her sharp eyes scanning him across the table. "You're thinner," she said bluntly. Michael shrugged. "Prison food isn't exactly a feast." She leaned forward. "Mr. Miller, this isn't sustainable. You're running yourself into the ground. If there's something you're hiding, someone, you need to tell me before you break." Michael looked at her, and for a moment the weight in his eyes almost cracked into words, but he held it back, swallowing the truth the way he had swallowed countless bites of tasteless food. "My story hasn't changed," he said softly. "I was driving." Claire sighed, frustration flashing across her face. She gathered her files and left, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete floor. The sound followed him long after she was gone, like the echo of a door closing. That night in the dim cell, Michael pressed his back against the wall and closed his eyes. Every breath felt heavier than the last. His body was faltering, his strength slipping, but he clung to the purpose that had carried him here. Sacrifice wasn't just a single act, it was 1,000 small deaths, repeated day after day. The loss of dignity, of health, of time with the people he loved. Each piece chipped away from him was another shield placed over his son. And though it hollowed him, he accepted it. Because love, in its truest form, was never measured by ease. It was measured by what you were willing to lose so another could live. Daniel sat in Claire Hastings' office, his hands twisting in his lap. The blinds were half drawn, slicing the afternoon sunlight into narrow stripes across the carpet. The room smelled faintly of old paper and coffee gone cold, but beneath it hung something heavier, expectation. Claire leaned back in her chair, studying him. Her gaze was steady, unblinking, the kind that stripped away every excuse before it reached the lips. She tapped her pen against the folder in front of her. "Daniel," she said, voice even but edged with urgency, "I need the truth. Your father's story doesn't align with the evidence. And if Whitmore pushes harder, he'll bury him, you understand that." Daniel's throat tightened. The name Whitmore was enough to make his stomach churn, the prosecutor who treated his father's sacrifice like fuel for his own ambition. Every headline, every press clip, painted Michael as reckless, careless, guilty beyond redemption. And all of it had been built on Daniel's silence. He opened his mouth, but the words clung to his tongue like lead. "How do you confess to destroying the man who gave everything for you?" That night, he walked the city streets, the cool air biting at his face. Storefronts glowed with neon signs, the hum of traffic surrounding him. He passed a diner where laughter spilled through the door, the smell of burgers and fries rushing out into the night. The normalcy of it struck him like a blow. People laughing, eating, living their small lives without the weight of a father behind bars. He ducked into an alley and pressed his back against the brick wall, rough and cold through his hoodie. His chest heaved. The choice pressed in on him from every side. Speak, and his father's sacrifice would be wasted. Stay silent, and his father's life would be consumed piece by a system eager to devour him. Neither felt like living. Back home, his mother sat at the kitchen table with the lamp casting her face in a tired glow. She was folding laundry again, shirts, socks, towels, her movements mechanical, her silence louder than any shouting. When Daniel entered, she didn't look up. Only her voice, flat and low, broke the air. "Did you see him today?" Daniel swallowed. I met with Claire." Her hands paused, clutching a shirt too tightly. "And she doesn't believe Dad was driving." At last his mother's eyes lifted, red-rimmed but sharp. For a moment Daniel thought she might scream, accuse, shatter the fragile quiet that held the house together, but she only whispered, almost too softly to hear, "Then why won't you tell her the truth?" The words cut deeper than any accusation. Daniel wanted to argue, to explain the impossible tangle of loyalty and fear and love that bound his silence, but no argument came, only the echo of her question, filling the hollow space inside him. The next day, Daniel sat in his car outside the courthouse. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles blanched. Through the windshield, he could see the swarm of reporters, the steps crowded with signs demanding justice. Voices rose in chants, their anger vibrating through the glass, through his bones. He imagined walking through those doors, standing before them all and telling the truth. He imagined the gasp, the fury, the betrayal in his father's eyes. The image made his stomach twist. But he also imagined staying silent, watching his father grow thinner, weaker, his cough deepening, his letters shorter and shakier. That thought broke him more. The car felt too small, the air too thick. He opened the window and let the cold wind rush in, carrying the scent of exhaust and city grime. His heart pounded against his ribs, each beat hammering the same question into his mind. If I speak, do I destroy him? If I stay silent, do I kill him anyway? That night Daniel sat at his desk, the architecture sketches still pinned to the wall above him. The sharp lines of the towers blurred through his tears. He pulled a notebook closer and began to write. The pen scratched across the page, his confession spilling out in uneven sentences. Every word felt like blood drawn from an open wound. When he finished, his hands shook so hard the notebook slipped from his grasp. It landed on the floor, pages splayed. He stared at it, chest heaving, as though the words might crawl back and erase themselves. But they didn't. They lay there, black ink on white paper, undeniable. For the first time, Daniel felt the path before him clearly. Not easy, not safe, but clear, and clarity was its own kind of torment. The courtroom was heavy with the smell of polished wood and old paper, the kind of air that carried centuries of judgment. Reporters filled the back rows, their pens scratching, cameras poised, waiting for cracks to form in the case that had become their daily headline. Daniel sat again in the gallery, head low, hoodie pulled tight around his face. His hands trembled against his knees. He told himself he was only here to listen, but deep down he knew he was waiting for the moment everything he and his father had tried to bury would claw its way to the surface. It came sooner than he expected. The prosecution called a witness, a man in his late 40s, dressed in a worn jacket, his hair flecked with gray. His voice carried the flat tone of someone who had repeated the same story more times than he could count. "I was walking home from the late shift," he said, eyes fixed on the prosecutor. "It was raining hard. I remember the sound of tires skidding. When I looked up, I saw the car." Whitmore leaned forward, his voice sharp. "And who did you see behind the wheel?" The witness hesitated, glancing toward Michael. Then his gaze shifted, sweeping across the gallery until it landed on Daniel. His brow furrowed, recognition flickering like a flame catching in the wind. I can't be sure," he stammered at first, but then his voice steadied. The driver looked younger, not him. He pointed toward Michael. It wasn't the father. The room erupted. Murmurs rippled through the benches, reporters scribbling furiously, cameras flashing. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. His breath came shallow, the world spinning around him. Whitmore pounced on the moment. "Are you saying you saw someone else driving?" The witness nodded, his eyes never leaving Daniel. "Yes, it was dark, but I saw enough. It wasn't him." Claire Hastings stood quickly. "Objection." The witness admitted uncertainty. "We cannot rely on impressions made in the middle of a storm." But the damage was done. The jury leaned forward, interest sharpened, as though the trial had suddenly shifted from a straightforward case to a mystery waiting to be solved. Michael's jaw clenched. He sat rigid at the defense table, his hands folded, his face unreadable. But inside he felt the ground shift beneath him, the sacrifice he had built so carefully beginning to crack. After court recess, Daniel stepped outside, the cold air hitting his face like a slap. Reporters swarmed, microphones shoved toward him. "Do you have a comment? Were you there that night? Is it true your father confessed to protect you?" Their voices overlapped, a storm of sound that made his ears ring. He pushed through the crowd, chest tight, vision tunneling. Every word felt like an arrow shot directly at the secret he had been carrying. By the time he reached his car, his body was shaking. He leaned against the door, the metal cold under his palms. His reflection in the window was pale, almost ghost-like, eyes wide with fear. The secret wasn't just heavy now, it was visible. It clung to him in the way people looked, in the way the questions cut, in the way the truth seemed to hover on every tongue. Inside the prison, Michael received the news through whispers. Another inmate slid a folded scrap of newspaper across the cafeteria table. On the front page was a headline, "Witness suggests son may have been driver." Michael's hands tightened around the paper, knuckles whitening. He folded it neatly, then set it aside as if neatness could keep chaos contained. But his mind raced. The sacrifice he had chosen, the wall of silence he had built, it was crumbling. When he returned to his cell, he sat on the cot, staring at the small barred window. The light slanted in, pale and weak, painting thin lines across the floor. He thought of Daniel, cornered now, forced into a choice he was never meant to face. And for the first time, Michael wondered if love had not saved his son but only delayed the inevitable breaking. That evening, Daniel's mother confronted him at the kitchen table. Her eyes were sharp, her voice trembling. "They're starting to see it. Everyone. How long do you think you can hide?" Daniel shook his head, voice barely a whisper. If I tell them, it kills him. If I stay silent, it kills me. She slammed her hand against the table, the sound sharp in the stillness. No, Daniel, it's already killing all of us. Her words hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. And Daniel realized the plan, once so carefully held together by silence and sacrifice, was unraveling faster than he could hold it. The courtroom was packed, the air charged with anticipation. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of neighbors, journalists, and strangers drawn by the promise of drama. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, striking dust motes that hung suspended like witnesses themselves. The murmur of voices rose and fell until the gavel slammed, sharp as a gunshot. All rise. The judge entered, robes brushing the floor. Everyone obeyed, the rustle of clothing filling the chamber before silence dropped again, heavy and expectant. Michael Miller stood at the defense table, his suit hanging loosely on his frame. Weeks in prison had thinned him, hollowed his cheeks, paled his skin. Yet his back remained straight, his eyes fixed forward, calm as stone. Beside him, Claire Hastings shuffled her papers, her jaw tight. She glanced toward the gallery, where Daniel sat pressed into the wooden bench, his hoodie drawn close, hands knotted together. His mother sat beside him, her lips moving silently, as if praying words too fragile to speak aloud. Whitmore rose first, his presence commanding. He buttoned his jacket, turned to the jury, and began. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice smooth, rehearsed, each word shaped for impact, "this case is not about sympathy. It is about accountability. A man drove recklessly. A man took a life. And now that man must face the consequences." He paced slowly, his shoes clicking against the polished floor. "You will hear distractions. You will hear attempts to blur the truth. But I ask you to hold on to one simple fact. Choices have consequences. And Michael Miller made his choice." His gaze slid toward Daniel in the gallery, lingering just long enough for Daniel to feel the weight of it. When it was Claire's turn, she rose with quieter strength. She didn't pace. She stood still, letting silence stretch a beat longer than comfortable before speaking. "The prosecution wants this to be simple, but truth is rarely simple. Evidence tells a story, yes, but when the story doesn't align, we have a duty to question it. This is not just about what happened that night. This is about whether the man sitting here," she gestured to Michael, "is truly the one responsible." Her words rippled through the room. Michael's stillness was a shield, but even he felt the tremor beneath it. Witnesses were called. The officer who first arrived at the scene, a medical examiner describing injuries with clinical precision, and finally the man from the rainy street, the witness whose words had cracked the story open. He took the stand again, his hands fidgeting with the brim of his cap. "I told you what I saw," he said, voice quivering but clear. "The driver looked younger. I can't explain it better than that, but it wasn't him." Whitmore attacked immediately. "Are you certain? In a storm, at night, with rain in your eyes, you expect us to trust what you think you saw?" The witness held firm. "I saw enough." The jury leaned forward, their expressions tightening. Doubt had been planted, and no cross-examination could pull it out completely. Through it all, Daniel sat rigid, sweat gathering at the back of his neck. Every sentence about the younger driver, every sideways glance felt like a spotlight searing his skin. His chest tightened until each breath scraped. He dug his nails into his palms, bring to himself, stay silent, but the silence pressed harder than any question. When Michael was called to testify, the room hushed to stillness. He walked to the stand slowly, his chains removed for the moment, but their absence felt louder than their presence. Claire asked the questions gently, her tone careful, but his answers were the same. "Yes, I was driving. Yes, I lost control. Yes, I accept responsibility." His voice carried no hesitation. Each answer was a stone placed carefully on the wall he had built around the truth. But when Whitmore rose to cross-examine, his words sliced sharper. "Mr. Miller, isn't it true that the evidence suggests someone else may have been behind the wheel? That the seat was adjusted forward, that the reaction times don't match yours?" Michael's jaw tightened. "I was driving." Whitmore pressed harder, stepping closer. "Or are you protecting someone, perhaps your son?" Gasps rippled through the gallery. Daniel's head snapped up, his heart slamming against his chest. His mother's hand gripped his arm, nails biting into his skin. Michael's eyes flickered just once toward his son before steadying again. "I was driving," he repeated, softer this time but no less firm. The silence that followed was suffocating. Whitmore let it hang, then stepped back, satisfied he had planted his seed of suspicion deep in the jury's mind. Daniel's breath came fast, shallow. His father's words were both shield and dagger. Every "I was driving" cut into him deeper than the last. He could feel the moment gathering, building like a storm that could no longer be held back. His fingers dug into the bench, his body trembling, every nerve screaming the truth he could no longer contain. The trial wasn't just his father's anymore. It was his. And he knew sooner than later his silence would shatter. The courtroom felt too small for Daniel's chest. Air pressed in around him, heavy, suffocating, as though the very walls knew the truth he carried and wanted to crush it out of him. Michael's words still echoed. "I was driving." Each repetition had been a hammer, sealing the coffin of his own freedom. The jury sat stiff, pens poised, faces unreadable. But Daniel saw the doubt in their eyes, saw how Whitmore's questions had planted suspicion like seeds waiting to bloom. His pulse thundered in his ears. The wood of the bench dug into his palms where he gripped it, knuckles pale, sweat slicking his skin. Every second stretched too long, every silence in the courtroom a mirror held up to his own cowardice. And then, like a crack splitting open, the sound burst from him. "Stop!" The word startled even him, raw and loud, ricocheting off the walls. Every head turned. The judge's gavel slammed once, sharp and commanding, but Daniel was already on his feet. His mother's hand shot out to pull him back, nails biting into his sleeve, but he shook free. Tears blurred his vision, the lights above smearing into halos. It wasn't him. His voice broke, hoarse but stronger with each word. "It wasn't my father driving that night, it was me." Gasps surged through the room, a wave of sound rising and crashing. Reporters leapt to their feet, pens scratching furiously, cameras snapping. The jurors froze, eyes wide, as if they had just witnessed something far more shocking than any evidence. Michael closed his eyes. Not in shock, not even in anger, just a slow, steady closing, like a man bracing himself against a storm he had prayed would never come. The judge's voice thundered. "Order, order in this court." But Daniel pressed forward, his chest heaving. He stood in the aisle, every eye on him, every breath caught in the balance. "I was behind the wheel," he said again, louder this time, his voice trembling but unshakable. "The rain was coming down so hard I could barely see. I lost control. I hit him, my father, he only confessed to protect me." The silence that followed was deeper than any gavel. Even the court stenographer's keys stilled, the moment too fragile to record. Whitmore's lips curled, the faintest trace of satisfaction flickering across his face, justice bending to his script, though not in the way he had expected. Claire rose quickly, her chair scraping, her voice sharp. "Your Honor, this is irregular." But Daniel cut across her, desperate, uncontainable. "Don't blame him. Don't take his life for mine. He's innocent. I'm the one who should be here, not him, never him." His knees buckled and he sank onto the bench at the aisle, burying his face in his hands. The sound that escaped him was half sob, half confession, the sound of a soul breaking open in public. Michael stood slowly at the witness stand. The guards shifted uneasily, unsure whether to restrain him or let him speak. His face was pale, but his eyes burned, not with anger, not with fear, but with something fiercer, love fighting against inevitability. "Daniel." His voice was quiet, but it carried through the silence like a bell. "Enough." Daniel shook his head, tears streaking down his face. "I can't let you die in here. I can't let you carry this anymore." Their eyes met across the distance, the son trembling, undone, the father steady, unbroken. And in that look was everything, the nights of sacrifice, the years of hard labor, the unspoken promise that love could bear anything. But here, in this moment, even love bent under the truth. Michael's lips parted as if to answer, but no words came. For the first time since the accident, he had no shield, no silence strong enough to protect them. The judge finally broke the stillness, gavel pounding. "This court will recess immediately." Her voice was sharp, cutting, but beneath it lingered something else, a tremor, as though even she had felt the weight of the confession pierce deeper than the law itself. Guards moved to escort Michael from the stand, but his gaze never left his son. Daniel's body shook with sobs, his shoulders collapsing inward, the release of a burden too heavy to carry alone. His mother's hand finally found his, gripping tightly, though her own face was wet with tears. The room erupted into noise, reporters shouting questions, the public buzzing with shock, whispers colliding like thunder. But for Michael and Daniel, the rest of the world had faded. All that remained was the truth laid bare, raw and irreversible, between a father who had tried to give everything and a son who could no longer take it. The courthouse still trembled with the aftershocks of Daniel's confession. When the gavel struck to restore order, the sound felt less like law and more like a heartbeat pounding through the room. Reporters scrambled out the doors, their voices trailing into the hallway, already feeding headlines to a waiting world. Inside, silence clung to the benches. The jurors shifted uneasily, some staring at Daniel with shock, others with a kind of reluctant respect. The judge leaned forward, her expression stern, but her eyes revealed the weight of the moment. "Mr. Miller," she said, addressing Daniel now, "what you've admitted cannot be ignored. This court will review your statement in full." Daniel's mother clutched his arm, her grip trembling, but she didn't try to silence him anymore. She knew there was no turning back. Michael, flanked by 2 guards, stood rigid at the witness stand. His lips pressed into a thin line, his shoulders heavy. He had prepared himself to carry the punishment, but he had not prepared for the truth to be torn from his son's chest in front of the world. The recess stretched into hours. Behind closed doors, lawyers argued, motions were filed, and the machinery of justice clanked to life, slow and merciless. When the court reconvened, the air felt different, thicker, charged, like the sky before a storm. Claire Hastings rose first. Her voice carried not only her client's defense, but the tremor of someone who had glimpsed a truth larger than the case itself. "Your Honor, this is no longer a matter of speculation. We have a sworn confession from the son. The evidence, seat adjustments, reaction times, the witness testimony supports it. We cannot, in good conscience, continue to hold Michael Miller accountable for a crime he did not commit." Whitmore stood next, his words sharper, angrier. "So we are to let a man walk free simply because his son decides to cry guilt on the stand? What precedent does that set? That courtroom can be swayed by theatrics." The judge silenced him with a raised hand. "This is not theatrics, Mr. Whitmore. This is law." Her gavel struck once more. "Michael Miller is hereby released from immediate custody. Daniel Miller will be released on bail under supervision, pending further proceedings." Paperwork moved quickly. By late afternoon, both father and son stepped down the courthouse stairs together, the cameras flashing as though the world had been waiting for this moment. Gasps rippled through the room again. Daniel felt his knees weaken, but he stood, shoulders square, ready to accept what he had avoided for so long. Michael's eyes closed briefly. Relief and grief collided inside him, 2 waves crashing in opposite directions. Outside the courthouse, the sky was streaked with gray, clouds heavy but unbroken. The crowd pressed close, cameras flashing, voices shouting questions that blended into a single roar. Daniel barely heard them. All he could hear was his own breath, harsh and unsteady, and the steady shuffle of his father's steps beside him. For the first time in weeks, Michael was free of chains. But the freedom felt fragile, like glass in his hands. They stopped at the bottom of the courthouse steps. Daniel turned to his father, his eyes wet, his voice raw. "I'm sorry, Dad. I should have spoken sooner. You tried to save me and I let you drown." Michael placed a hand on his son's shoulder, the gesture firm despite the weakness in his body. "Daniel," he said softly, "you think I regret what I did? No, I would have carried it until my last breath if it meant giving you another chance. That's what fathers do." Daniel shook his head. "But it broke you. I watched it break you." Michael's eyes softened. "Maybe, but it also showed me something I never doubted but needed to see. You're strong enough to stand, even when it costs you everything." Later that night, the family sat together for the first time in months. The kitchen table, once a place of silence and resentment, now felt fragile with possibility. The overhead light hummed softly. Steam rose from untouched cups of tea, filling the air with the faint scent of chamomile. His mother spoke first, her voice hoarse from tears she had not allowed herself until now. "You nearly destroyed us both," she whispered, looking from Daniel to Michael. "And yet here we are." Her hands trembled as she reached across the table, resting them over theirs. The gesture carried no promises, no erasure of pain, but something more enduring: acknowledgement. Daniel lowered his head, shame burning through him. "I don't know how to make it right." Michael squeezed his hand. "You don't make it right. You live it right. That's all we can do." In the silence that followed, forgiveness did not arrive like lightning. It arrived slowly, like dawn creeping into a darkened room, faint, fragile but unstoppable. The night after the trial, the Miller home was quiet in a way it hadn't been for months. Not the heavy silence of anger or grief, but a fragile stillness like the hush after a storm, when the ground is still wet, the air heavy with the memory of rain, and yet the sky has begun to clear. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring at the grain of the wood beneath his hands. The surface was scarred with years of family meals, spilled coffee, homework scribbled in pencil, ordinary marks of an ordinary life. And yet tonight every scratch felt sacred, reminders that this table had held them together even when they were breaking apart. Across from him, his father sipped slowly from a chipped mug. The steam from the tea curled upward, touching his face with warmth. Michael's body was thinner now, his shoulders stooped, but his eyes, those steady, unyielding eyes, still carried the same fire. Daniel wanted to speak, but his throat tightened. How do you tell a man that his sacrifice both saved you and nearly destroyed you? How do you thank someone for giving you back your life at the cost of his own freedom? Michael set down the mug and looked at him. You don't need to say it, son. I know. But Daniel shook his head, his voice breaking. No, Dad, you don't know how it felt watching you waste away in that cell because of me. Every night I thought I'd never breathe again unless I told the truth, and when I finally did, it felt too late. Michael leaned forward, his hand steady on the table. It wasn't too late, you found your voice, and that's all I ever wanted, for you to be strong enough to stand even when it's hard. His words sank into Daniel's chest, deeper than guilt, deeper than regret. They landed in the place where love lives, the part of a son that knows no matter how flawed he is, his father's love does not bend. In the days that followed, the legal system ground forward. Daniel was processed, questioned, weighed in the balance of justice. The headlines shifted, son confesses in courtroom drama. Neighbors whispered still, but their tones changed. Some spoke with scorn, others with pity, but a few with respect. Michael, though technically free, carried his own sentence. The toll on his body, the time lost, the fracture in his marriage, all of it lingered. Yet he walked through it with the same quiet dignity he had always carried. He knew justice had been served in law, but in life the scars would remain. And yet he chose forgiveness. One evening, as they sat again at the kitchen table, Michael reached for his son's hand. Daniel, you'll make mistakes again. Maybe not this big, God willing, but mistakes all the same. Don't waste your life trying to be perfect. Live it honest. Live it brave, that's all I ask. Daniel's eyes filled, his throat too tight to answer. He simply nodded, letting the warmth of his father's hand steady him. Weeks later, Daniel visited the victim's family. The house was small, the front porch sagging under years of weather. He carried no speech, no rehearsed words, only the raw truth in his chest. The widow answered the door, her face lined with grief that time had not softened. Daniel's voice shook as he spoke. I was the driver that night. I can't undo it. I can only say I'm sorry, and I will spend my life trying to live in a way that honors the life I took. There was no forgiveness in her eyes that day, only silence, and Daniel understood. Forgiveness was not owed, it was a gift. All he could do was leave the door open should it ever come. As he walked away, the evening air smelled of cut grass and wood smoke. The world was ordinary again. But Daniel felt changed, as though carrying the truth spoken aloud, lived fully, had shifted the weight from guilt into responsibility. Months turned into a year. Daniel started over, not with skyscrapers and city lights, but with small work, designing homes, helping neighbors repair what had broken. He found solace in building things meant not to touch the sky, but to hold people together. Michael, though older now, spent his mornings in the garden, his hands in the soil. His cough lingered, his body weakened, but his presence remained a pillar. And every evening they sat together, father and son, bound not by silence but by a truth that had nearly destroyed them and ultimately set them free. Daniel once asked his father if he regretted it, the lie, the prison, the sacrifice. Michael smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun dipped low. Regret? No. If I had to choose again, I'd do it the same, because love isn't about keeping score. It's about giving what you can, even if it costs you, especially then. Those words stayed with Daniel, etched into him like stone, and in time he learned to carry them not as chains but as wings. Dear friends, that is the story of a father who carried the weight of his son's mistake, and of a son who found the courage to step into the light of truth. It is a story of justice, yes, but more than that, it is a story of forgiveness. Forgiveness between father and son, forgiveness of self, and the kind of forgiveness we all long for when we stumble under the weight of being human, because family isn't perfect. It is raw, fragile, messy. But it is also the place where love shows its strongest face in sacrifice, in truth, in the willingness to stand beside one another even in the darkest hours. And so I leave you with this. Cherish the ones who stand at your table. Speak the words you've been holding back, and never underestimate the power of forgiveness to mend what you thought was beyond repair. Thank you, dear listeners, for walking this journey with me. If this story touched you, I invite you to subscribe to the channel to stay with us for more tales of family, sacrifice, and love that endures. Please share it with someone who might need this reminder today. From my heart to yours, I wish you health, peace, and a family bound not by perfection, but by love that never gives up. Good night, and may your homes always be filled with light.